Okay, welcome to the special senses and the eye dissection. I do appreciate the fact that we were able to dissect an eye. It's my favorite dissection, so I'm glad we got to see some structures of the sheep eye. But I want to go ahead and go through some of the models on here because they do look a little different from the models that might be actually on the test. So let's go through these labels. All right, this is showing the eye. We'll start with this line right here and then work our way around. This line is pointing to this gland, which is in the superior and lateral orbit of the eye. This is the lacrimal gland right here. It produces tears, which then come out and they bathe the eye, and then they're going to drain into a medial drainage canal into the pharynx. But this is the lacrimal gland right here. This line is pointing to this, which is a smooth muscle. It's a diaphragm that's going to control how much light enters the eye. This is the iris. Iris is colored. It could be blue, it could be brown, it could be green, or some variation of thereof. This is the iris. And then this line right here is pointing to the white part of the eye. This is the sclera. The white part of the eye is called the sclera. Then this last line right here, if we follow it down, it is pointing to the inside part of the iris, which is an opening called the pupil. So here's the pupil. Light can only get into the eye through the pupil. It is the pupil that will be constricted or dilated depending on whether you're in the parasympathetic or the sympathetic system mode. All right, we're going to continue with the eye. We'll start with this structure and work our way around. So this is pointing to the white of the eye. Again, this is still the sclera. So the sclera is the white of the eye. This line, if you follow it down, is pointing to this pigmented part of the eye known as the choroid, also known as the choroid coat. So this is the choroid of the eye. This line, we follow it down. This is actually pointing to the ciliary muscle. The ciliary muscle is actually attached to the lens, which is going to reflect the image to the back of the retina. So this is the ciliary muscle. And then this line, if we continue down, it's pointing to the iris right here. And then this line, if we follow it, is pointing to the opening in the iris, which is called the pupil. Okay, now we can see some different fluids in the eye, plus some other structures inside of the eye if we cut it in half. We're going to start right here and work our way around. This is pointing to, one guess, again, it is pointing to the sclera, the white part of the eye. This line is pointing to the pigmented part of the tunics. This is the choroid coat. This line, if we follow it, is pointing to the inner part of the inside of the eye. This is the retina, where we have the photoreceptor cells, the rods and the cones. This line, it is pointing to what would look like a jello mold. This is the vitreous humor. The vitreous humor is thick and it's like gelatin. It helps keep the shape of the eye. This line right here is pointing to this structure, which is known as the lens. So this is the lens. All photons of light enter through the pupil. They go through the lens and through the vitreous humor to reach the macula lutea, or the fovea centralis of the retina. All right, now this line, coming here, is pointing to the ciliary muscle, which is attached to the suspensory ligaments that are attached to the lens. So this is the ciliary muscle. And then this line, again, is pointing to the colored part of the eye. This is the iris. All right, looking inside of the eye, we're going to start with this structure right here. This is pointing to the ciliary muscle. The lens has been removed, but the ciliary muscle is actually attached to the lens. So it can change the shape of the lens so you can focus. This line is pointing to the retina. This is where we have photoreceptor cells, rods for light and dark images, and then cones for color vision. This line, it is pointing to the fovea centralis. It'll be located right here. It's adjacent to the optic disc and medial. And then this line, it is pointing to the optic disc. There are no photoreceptor cells at the optic disc because this is where the retina exits and becomes the optic nerve. This is where the blood vessels enter and exit through the eye. So there are no photoreceptor cells. This is your blind spot. This is called the optic disc right here. And then this line, if we follow it, it is pointing to the ciliary body. All right, another picture of the eye. We'll start with this structure and then work our way around. This is pointing to cranial nerve number 2. This is the optic nerve right here. Continue down around. This is pointing to the white part of the eye. This is the sclera right here. Continue on around. This is pointing to a clear part of the eye. It's the anterior pole of the eye is attached to the sclera. This is called the cornea. All right, so this is the cornea. Continue around. This is pointing to the opening inside of the iris. This is the pupil. Speaking of the iris, this next line right here comes all the way down and points to the iris. And then this line right here comes all the way down and is pointing to the ciliary muscle. Ciliary muscle. C-I-L-I-A-R-Y muscle. All right, looking inside of the eye, we'll start with this line. This line is pointing to this tissue, this nervous tissue that's on the inside. This is the retina. So this line is pointing to the retina. This line right here is pointing to an area where we have the highest concentration of cones. This is called the fovea, or fovea centralis, either way. And then this line right here is pointing to where the blood vessels are entering through the eye. This is called the optic disc. All right, continuing with the eye. Now we can see the rectus muscles that are attached to the eye. These are voluntary muscles to move the eye around in the orbit so you can focus in on objects. We'll start at this very top one right here. This is pointing to the superior rectus muscle. Whenever it contracts, it rotates the eye upward. This line is pointing to this muscle that goes all the way around here through this little ligament and attaches in a weird fashion. This is an oblique muscle. This is the superior oblique muscle. This line is pointing to this little bit of tissue right here. This is a piece of connective tissue known as the trochlea. So this line is pointing to the trochlea. A little bit of trivia question here. What cranial nerve goes through the trochlea? That would be the trochlear cranial nerve. All right, and then this line, we follow it, follow it, follow it. It's pointing to this muscle, which we can't really see very well, but this is the medial rectus muscle. Whenever it contracts, then the eye is going to rotate towards the nose. So this is the medial rectus muscle. And then come around here, this is pointing to the opening inside of the iris. This is the pupil. And then this one right here, we follow it, it attaches to the eye and goes around in this direction. This is called the inferior oblique muscle. And then this line, we follow it, it is pointing to the sclera. So this is the white part of the eye again, the sclera. And then we have this line, it is pointing to the lateral rectus muscle. How can you tell the difference between lateral and medial? Well, lateral will be at your temple, medial will be where your nose is, which is going to be over here. So medial rectus on this side, lateral rectus on this side. And then this line, come all the way down, it is pointing to the inferior rectus muscle. Whenever it contracts, then the eye rotates straight down, like you're going to look at your feet. And then this line is not pointing to a muscle at all. It is pointing to the optic nerve. So this line is pointing to the optic nerve. This is the posterior pole of the eye, or the back end of the eye. Some of these structures are going to be the same. This line right here is pointing to the sclera. The white part of the eye is known as the sclera. This line is pointing to the optic nerve. That's easy enough. So here's the optic nerve. Let's go up here. If it attaches in an oblique direction, this is an oblique. This is the superior part of the eye. So this line is pointing to the superior oblique muscle. This line right here is pointing to the inferior oblique muscle. And then this line is pointing to the inferior rectus muscle. So superior rectus muscle up here, inferior rectus muscle down here, superior oblique right underneath the superior rectus, and then we have the inferior oblique, and it's going to be right underneath the inferior rectus. All right, the ear. The ear is separated into three parts. There's an outer ear, which is where I'm circling now. Then there's the middle ear, and then there's an inner ear. So we have different structures. I think if you still have the PowerPoint that was on Blackboard before Spring break, it's already labeled for you. So I'm going to go through this pretty fast because you've already got a PowerPoint with it labeled. All right, this line, it is pointing to the auricle. A-U-R-I-C-L-E. It funnels sound waves into the next part, which is this line, the external acoustic meatus. All right, this line right here, this one's pointing to the tympanic membrane, also known as the eardrum. This line is pointing to the tympanic cavity. The middle ear cavity is an air-filled cavity. There should be no fluid. If there's fluid here, that means you have an ear infection. This line is pointing to this tube. It's called the auditory tube. It's also known as the pharyngotympanic tube. It's also known as the eustachian tube. This equalizes the air pressure inside of the middle ear. This line right here, we follow down, is pointing to the ossicles. The three smallest bones in the body are in the middle ear, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. All right, this line is pointing to the semicircular duct right here. Same thing with this line, pointing to the semicircular duct, as well as this line, pointing to the semicircular duct. They're inside of the semicircular canals. This line is pointing to the vestibule right here, which is for equilibrium. So are the semicircular ducts. They are for dynamic equilibrium. The vestibules for static equilibrium. And then this line is pointing to cranial nerve number 8, the vestibulocochlear cranial nerve. And then this line right here is pointing to the cochlea. Inside of the cochlea are special cells used for hearing. All right, looking at just the inner ear, this is kind of an odd angle, and we don't have a model like this, but we could very well ask the question on the test. This line is pointing to the cochlea. Kind of looks like a snail shell. This line and this line, they both form cranial nerve number 8. We have the cochlear division of the vestibulocochlear nerve, and here's the vestibular division of the vestibulocochlear nerve. This line is pointing to the vestibule right here. This line is pointing to the semicircular canal, which surrounds the semicircular duct. So this line, semicircular canal. This line, semicircular canal. And then this line is pointing to the stapes, which is an ossicle, and then this line is pointing to the incus, and then this line is pointing to the malleus. So malleus right here, incus is second, stapes is third. All right, this is a cross-section of the cochlea. The inside of the cochlea, it is basically three tubes. There's one tube on top, there's one tube in the middle, and one tube on bottom. And they're filled with fluids called lymphs. Perilymph is going to be in the top chamber and the bottom chamber because they are part of the bony labyrinth. The middle chamber contains endolymph. So endolymph is a part of the membranous labyrinth. All right, so this top line, we're pointing to this chamber on top. Got to know the name of the chamber. It's called scala vestibuli. So scala vestibuli, which is filled with the fluid known as perilymph. This membrane right below it, this is called the vestibular membrane right here. And again, you already have this PowerPoint. Well, you have this picture in the PowerPoint. It's already labeled for you. So this is the vestibular membrane. And then this next chamber is called the cochlear duct. It is filled with endolymph, E-N-D-O, lymph. So here's the cochlear duct. This line is pointing to this membrane that forms a roof. This is called the tectorial membrane. So here's the tectorial membrane. This line, which is pointing to the organ right below it, this is called the spiral organ of Corti. Spiral organ of Corti, C-O-R-T-I. And then this line is pointing to this membrane underneath that spiral organ. This is called the basilar membrane. Basilar like basement. So this is the basilar membrane. And then this chamber on down below, it's called scala tympani. So here's the scala tympani. We're going to look at it a little closer, focusing in on the cochlear duct. So this line is pointing to this chamber, which is called the scala media, but it's also known as the cochlear duct. So this is the cochlear duct. This line is pointing to the tectorial membrane right here. This line is pointing to the vestibular membrane right here. And then this line is pointing to the basilar membrane, like a basement. So basilar membrane, spiral organ of Corti. Here's the tectorial membrane. This is the cochlear duct filled with endolymph. Here's the vestibular membrane. There we go. Looking inside of the nasal cavity. This is like looking in the torso half head. All right, we're going to start back here. This line is pointing to this bone right here, which is called the superior nasal concha. Superior nasal concha, C-O-N-C-H-A. This line right here is pointing to the olfactory bulb. Olfactory bulb is part of the cranial nerve number 1, the olfaction cranial nerve. And then this line is pointing to the olfactory nerves. Odor molecules will enter through the nostrils, through the nares. They'll circulate around the concha, and then they bind or find a receptor in the olfactory nerves. All right, now these pictures are actually of a cow eye, but these structures are easier to see. So we're going to look at these same structures. They look just like pictures we would have on the test anyway. All right, so this line, we're pointing to structures on the outside of the eye. This is pointing to the sclera of the eye because it's white. And then this line is pointing to the cornea of the eye. It should be clear, but this is not a live eye. It is dead, so it's full of bacteria. So this is the cornea right here. This line is pointing to cranial nerve number 2, the optic cranial nerve. Now we're going to look inside the eye. This line is pointing to this structure, which is the lens for focusing on images. And then this line is pointing to this tissue paper-like tunic, which is the retina. So here's the retina. All right, looking at the eye from the front, from the anterior view. So this line is pointing to the cornea, right here. This line is pointing to the sclera, the white of the eye. Cutting into the eye, this line, we've separated the cornea from the back part of the eye. So this is the cornea, this line right here. This line coming up this way is pointing to this structure, which is the lens. And then this line, again, is pointing to the white of the eye, which is the sclera. All right, last picture. This line right here is pointing to the opening of the iris. This is the pupil. So this line is pointing to the pupil. This line is pointing to the lens. All right, so here's the lens. And then this line, it is pointing to the sclera, the white part of the eye. And then this is pointing to that thick, gelatinous humor inside the eye known as the vitreous humor. So this is the vitreous humor. And then this line is actually pointing to the pigmented part of the eye, which is the choroid coat. Okay, that is the end of the special senses.